Whispers stalk Baker Street after dark. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments make this journey special. Onward to the mystery. It has often been my lot in setting down some small portion of the remarkable exploits of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes to encounter the incredulity of those who have not known him as I have known him. They will concede his powers so long as they are exercised upon matters of fraud, theft, or murder, but balk at those episodes which skirted the edges of the inexplicable. And yet it is precisely in such cases that his cold reason shone with the greatest brilliance, stripping from them all semblance of the supernatural and restoring them, so to speak, to the jurisdiction of common sense. Among these more singular adventures, there is one which, until now, I have hesitated to recount. It was not that the events themselves were more terrible than those I have previously described. Indeed, I have seen bloodier crimes and more savage villains. Rather, it was the setting that so disturbed me. For the thing which came to be known in the newspapers as the haunting of Baker Street did not concern a remote country house or some ruined abbey, but our own snug quarters at 221B, those very rooms which I had long regarded as the safest and most rational of sanctuaries. It was in the late autumn of 1809, as near as I can fix it, that the affair began. London lay under one of those persistent yellow fogs which seem to seep into the bones and dim the spirits. The lamps along Baker Street were already lit, though the hour was barely 4, and the muffled clatter of traffic below floated up to our windows like the dull murmur of a distant sea. I had been out for the better part of the afternoon, attending to my practice, which at that time still claimed a portion of my energies. A troublesome case of bronchitis in a child at Montague Street, an elderly lady with a heart complaint in Wimpole Road, and a young clerk whose nerves had been thoroughly shattered by overwork and insufficient nourishment. These had occupied me until the light had faded to a smudged grey. As I mounted the familiar 17 steps to our rooms, I was surprised to find Mrs. Hudson herself standing at the landing, wringing her hands in a manner most foreign to her usually composed demeanour. "Oh, Dr. Watson, sir," she exclaimed in a hushed, agitated whisper. "I'm that glad you're home. It's enough to give a body the creeps." "It is indeed." "Why, Mrs. Hudson," said I, handing her my hat and gloves, "whatever is the matter? Has something occurred to alarm you?" She cast a nervous glance down the stairwell before replying. "It's them noises again, sir. And the knocking. Mr. Holmes, he says as there's an explanation, but I don't see how there can be a Christian explanation for what I heard. Not at that hour." Come, I said, though I confess her evident distress unsettled me. "We shall see what Mr. Holmes makes of it. Is he in?" "In the sitting-room, sir. Hasn't stirred out all day. But it's not him that frightens me, it's what comes when he rings for me and I'm on the stairs. You listen to him, sir, you'll see." She stepped aside to let me pass, muttering something about respectable houses and unnatural goings-on as she descended. I pushed open the door to our sitting-room and was immediately greeted by the familiar sight of Holmes curled in the armchair by the fire, his long, spare frame folded upon itself, his eyes closed, and his hands pressed together with the fingertips touching his brow. The air was blue with tobacco smoke, and a chemical odour, sharp and metallic, lingered faintly about the room. "Ah, Watson," he said without opening his eyes, "you have been detained at least 20 minutes longer than you anticipated. I trust the child is somewhat easier?" "You astonish me, Holmes," I replied, shrugging off my coat. "I did not mention the child." "No," he murmured. "But the small smear of syrup upon your left cuff, combined with the faint impression of a sticky hand upon your right trouser leg, are quite eloquent. The presence of the syrup suggests a household with young children. The position of the marks, a fretful little patient who sought comfort by clinging to you. As for your delay, the taxi you took home, there is a faint spatter of mud upon your right shoe, of that particular clay which collects in the gutter at the north end of Montague Street. You would not have walked that distance in the fog. I laughed and took my usual chair. You were quite correct in every particular, said I. The child was iller than I had supposed, and the mother, poor soul, would have detained me longer still if I had not torn myself away. But tell me, Holmes, what of these noises which have so discomposed Mrs. Hudson? Holmes opened his eyes at that and regarded me with a curious expression in which amusement and something more wary seemed to mingle. "So she has complained to you, has she?" he said. It was inevitable. Mrs. Hudson is an excellent landlady, but her imagination, when once engaged, is not easily restrained. "I have never known her so perturbed," I answered. "She spoke of knocking and, if I heard her rightly, of unnatural goings-on." Holmes rose languidly to his feet, crossed to the mantelpiece, and took his pipe from between his teeth. "Watson," said he, "have you ever reflected upon the peculiar nature of our lodgings?" "Peculiar?" I repeated, glancing about at the shabby but comfortable armchairs, the bookshelves laden with monographs, the chemical apparatus upon the side table, and the violin case upon the sofa. "They have many peculiarities, no doubt, but I confess I had not ranked their nature among them. We are," he continued, "perhaps the most conspicuous and yet the most secretive pair in Baker Street. Our address is known to half of London, and yet there are few who may claim to know what passes on this floor. Men of all ranks and conditions come and go at all hours, dukes and ostlers, bankers and burglars. Secrets of the gravest import are discussed within these four walls, and matters upon which lives, fortunes, and reputations depend. Is it any wonder that the house itself acquires in the minds of the more credulous a certain sinister character?" "You mean to say," I declared, "that these disturbances are mere gossip, that nothing has occurred?" "On the contrary," said Holmes, "something has most decidedly occurred. Pray listen." He raised a long, attenuated finger. For a moment there was only the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of wheels from the street below. Then, clear and distinct, there came the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside our door, slow, measured footsteps, ascending one by one. "There!" I exclaimed, half rising from my chair. "Someone is coming up now." Holmes's eyes had narrowed to slits. "Are they?" he remarked quietly. "Count them, Watson." I listened intently. 1, 2, 3, 8. I counted under my breath. The tread was indeed peculiar, neither the brisk step of a messenger nor the heavy tramp of a constable, but something deliberate and oddly dragging. Up and up it came, to the landing outside our door. And then silence. "Whoever it is has stopped," I said. "Surely they must be at our very threshold." Holmes's gaze did not waver from the door. The latch remained unmoved. No knock sounded upon the panel. "Now, Watson," he said softly, "observe the time." I glanced instinctively at the mantelpiece. "It is 10 minutes to 4, I replied. "Precisely. The same hour, to within a minute, at which Mrs. Hudson heard that same tread last Tuesday and on the Friday before that. She will tell you that she opened the door upon the landing and found no one there. On each occasion the sound ceased at this very point." A faint chill ran down my spine. "You do not mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," he cut in briskly. "I merely state facts. We have heard the steps, we have seen no visitor. Now you will oblige me by doing what Mrs. Hudson did not do." "What is that?" "Open the door, quickly." I crossed the room and pulled the door wide. The landing lay empty before me. The gas jet on the wall flickered feebly in the draught. There was no sign of any human presence, nor could I hear receding footsteps below or above. "Well," called Holmes. "There is no one," I admitted. "The stairs are clear." "So I supposed." Holmes had resumed his position by the fire. "Close the door, Watson. Our visitor, whatever his nature, is not inclined to show himself yet." "You speak as though—" I began. "As though we were dealing with a ghost?" He smiled thinly. "You know my views on that subject. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. We have not yet eliminated anything, therefore we refrain from conclusions." "It is nevertheless most uncanny," I insisted, returning to my chair. "To the imaginative, perhaps. To me it is merely an interesting little phenomenon, which may or may not be connected with a matter of considerably greater importance." "A matter of greater importance?" I repeated. Holmes tossed me a folded copy of the Evening Standard, which lay upon the table. "Pray read the paragraph I have marked," said he. I smoothed the paper and found, in the police news column, the following brief notice: "Mysterious death in Baker Street. Early this morning, a man of about 50 years of age, respectably dressed, was found lying insensible upon the pavement within a few yards of number 221B, Baker Street. He was removed to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where he expired without regaining consciousness. No marks of violence were discovered upon the body, and no papers capable of establishing his identity were found. The police are investigating." "Good heavens, Holmes!" I cried. "A man dies at our very door, and you say nothing of it until now." "My dear Watson," he replied coolly, "what could I have said that the paragraph does not? I have not yet seen the body nor the scene. Until I do so, I am as capable of idle speculation as any leader writer in Fleet Street. That is an occupation I leave to them with pleasure." "But surely," I protested, "such a coincidence. The unexplained footsteps on our stairs, and now this unknown man found near our door." "Coincidence?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Or design? That is precisely the point upon which I propose to enlighten myself. The inspector from the yard will be here within the half-hour, if I am not mistaken. The matter has already been brought to my notice in a less public manner. You have had a communication? Two, in fact. The first reached me at a little after 11 this morning." He drew from the mantelpiece a square envelope of cheap paper and tossed it into my lap. "Be so good as to examine it." The address, written in a cramped, spidery hand, ran simply: "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B, Baker Street." There was no stamp and no postmark. "Delivered by hand, then," I observed. "Precisely. Now read the enclosure." The single sheet within bore but one line in the same curious hand: "He is not the first, and he will not be the last." The debt of Baker Street is not yet paid. There was no signature. I confess that as I read these words, a distinct uneasiness took possession of me. "This is monstrous, Holmes," I exclaimed. "A threat, nay, a boast, of further crimes, and one already accomplished, if we are to connect this with the death mentioned in the paper." "If is the operative word, Watson," said he. "We must beware of interpreting facts in the light of our fears. Nevertheless, you will admit that such a note, arriving upon the very morning of an unexplained death outside our door, is at least worthy of attention. And when one adds to it the phenomenon you have just witnessed—" "The footsteps," I murmured. "Just so. A sound without a visible cause, repeated upon fixed days and at a fixed hour. Now, what do we know of sounds, Watson?" "That they must proceed from some physical agency," I answered, somewhat at a loss. "Excellent. You are making progress. A ghost who walks is one thing. A ghost who walks in regular rhythm on specific days at specific times is quite another. The former belongs to the province of the village sexton. the latter to that of the logician. I incline to the latter view. You believe, then, that there is a human hand behind all this? I asked. I believe nothing, he corrected me. I find it highly probable. But belief without proof is a luxury I do not permit myself. One other point, however, I may already state with confidence. And what is that? Holmes took the note from me, held it to the firelight, and sniffed at the paper. The writer of this communication, said he, is no common criminal. He is educated, scrupulous, and in a position which affords him access to information not yet in the public prints. Moreover, he has some personal connection, direct or indirect, with this house, and with me in particular. How can you possibly know that? I demanded. Holmes's lips twitched in that half-smile which always heralded a little lecture upon his methods. My dear fellow, he said, you observe, yet you do not see. The pen, the ink, the choice of words, the debt of Baker Street, these are not the tools or the idiom of the costermonger or the thug. But we shall have time for that presently. The second communication is perhaps even more curious. He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a small, flat object wrapped in tissue paper. He handed it to me with a gesture almost of distaste. Kindly unfold it. Within the paper lay a narrow strip of black cloth, about 6 inches in length, edged with frayed silver thread. It might have been cut from some larger garment, a sash, or perhaps the lining of a cloak. Upon one end was embroidered in tarnished silver a single letter, H. Found this morning upon our own doorstep, said Holmes. No one saw it laid there. It is, you will observe, not of English manufacture. The weave is too fine, the thread too loose. Germany or the Low Countries, I should say, but we shall verify that in due time. I turned the scrap over in my fingers, conscious of a growing sense of foreboding. A dead man in the street, anonymous threats, uncanny sounds on our very stairs, and this mysterious fragment, I said. Holmes, I do not like it. Nor do I, Watson, he replied, and there was a gravity in his tone which struck me more forcibly than any protestations could have done. I do not like it at all. For once the storm appears to be coming to us instead of our going out to meet it. Even as he spoke, there came a brisk rat-tat upon our door, not the slow, dragging tread of the unseen visitor, but the sharp knock of a man of business. "Enter!" cried Holmes. The door opened to admit a stout, sandy-haired gentleman in a frock-coat, whose florid face and prominent jaw were familiar to me. "Inspector Lestrade," I exclaimed. "The same, Dr. Watson," said he, with a brief nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes. I take it you've seen the evening papers?" "I do not derive my information from so fallible a source," Holmes returned. "Pray take a seat, Inspector. You are here about the man who died in the street this morning, I presume?" Lestrade glanced sharply at him. "Well, I didn't expect you'd be in the dark about it," he admitted. "Yes, that's my errand. It's an uncommon queer business, Mr. Holmes, and I'm bound to say, though I don't hold with fancies, there's some in the division as are using words I don't care to repeat in a respectable house." "You refer to the word haunted, no doubt," said Holmes dryly. "It has already been employed by our landlady. Pray tell me the facts, Lestrade, and let us see whether the ghost of Baker Street is a yard matter or mine." Lestrade shifted in his chair, his small grey eyes moving from Holmes to myself and back again. "Well, sir," he began, "the fact is, this isn't the first time. That's what makes it uncommon. There's been more than one death in this street, and some of us are wondering whether there isn't a pattern in it. As to what that pattern is, well, I was hoping you might help us there, Mr. Holmes, for if there's a human brain at the bottom of it, it's a clever one, and no mistake." Holmes steepled his long fingers and leaned forward, his keen gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the inspector. "Then, Lestrade," said he, in a tone of quiet eagerness I knew well, "you may count upon my very best efforts. For if Baker Street has indeed contracted a debt, as some appear to think, I am resolved that we shall discover to whom it is owed, and in what coin he proposes that it shall be paid." And so, with the fog thickening against the panes, and the muffled city murmuring below, there began that strange and sinister inquiry which was destined to shake even my own solid belief in the prosaic nature of crime, and to add yet another laurel to the already burdened crown of my remarkable friend Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade drew a folded paper from his pocket and smoothed it upon his knee. "The man has died this morning," he said, "was first seen about 7:30. A constable on his beat noticed him leaning against the railings a few doors down from this house. Before the constable could reach him, he slid to the pavement. He was breathing, but barely. They took him straight to Bart's. He never spoke a word, and by 9 o'clock he was dead." "Cause?" Holmes asked. "That's the trouble," Lestrade replied, his ruddy face clouding. "The surgeon at the hospital can't make it out. There's no stab, no bruise to count for anything, no poison that he can put his finger on. Heart, lungs, brain, there's wear and tear, as you'd expect in a man of his years, but nothing to say why he should drop in the street like that." Holmes's eyes had taken on that faraway expression, which told me his mind was fitting each new fact into some inner pattern. "His clothing?" he said. "Good quality, though a bit shiny at the seams," Lestrade answered. "Overcoat, decent boots, linen clean enough, but nothing on him, Mr. Holmes. Not a card, not a letter, not so much as a laundry mark we can trace. His pockets had been gone through. There was 8 shillings loose and a handkerchief with no initials. That's all." "So he was searched," Holmes mused. "Yet whoever searched him left the money. Interesting. And you spoke of this not being the first such occurrence, Lestrade." The inspector hesitated, then drew a deeper breath, as though the admission cost him something of professional pride. "That's right," he said. "You'll remember perhaps a case 6 months back. Man found in Baker Street at night, dead before he could be moved. It was put down as failure of the heart. Nothing to trouble you with, or so we thought." "I remember the notice in the papers," Holmes replied. "A clerk from the city, if my memory serves." "Just so. Name of Phelps, employed in a shipping office, no suspicion of anything amiss at the time. And 2 months before that there was an elderly gentleman, Mr. Harrington, who collapsed on his way from a club in Cavendish Square. His doctor signed the certificate, and we had no call to interfere. But if you take them together, Mr. Holmes, Harrington, Phelps, and now this unknown man, all stricken within a stone's throw of your very door, all with no clear cause, well, some of us at the Yard begin to wonder whether Baker Street hasn't got itself a sort of curse." "Superstition at Scotland Yard?" Holmes murmured. "What a sign of the times! And yet you came to me, not to a medium. That, at least, is in your favour, Lestrade." The inspector coloured slightly. "I came because the superintendent thought if there is a living hand in this, you're the one to spot it," he said shortly. "And there's talk, well, you know how men will talk. They say as there's something queer about this house, lights at all hours, strange visitors, that sort of thing. This morning's man was found nearest to your number. It won't be long before someone asks whether there's a connection." Holmes shot me a swift glance, as if to gauge the effect of Lestrade's words upon me, then turned back to the inspector. "If there is a connection," he said quietly, "I shall be the first to proclaim it, but we shall proceed by facts, not gossip. I will see the body, Lestrade, and the place where he fell. You have no objection?" "None at all. I've left instructions at Bart's that you're to have every facility. As to the street, well, you know Baker Street as well as any man." "Better," said Holmes with a ghost of a smile. You will accompany us, Watson?" "Certainly," I replied, for the uneasiness that had beset me seemed now to take the more bracing form of resolve. "Excellent," Holmes said. "We shall start at once. There is just one small matter before we go, Lestrade. You have said nothing of footsteps upon your report." "Footsteps?" The inspector looked blank. The slow, measured tread upon these stairs, recurring at fixed intervals, Holmes said. "You have not heard it yourself?" Lestrade gave a snort. "I've heard plenty of talk about footsteps and knockings," he said, rising to his feet. "But I leave that to the servants' hall. I deal in what I can see and handle, Mr. Holmes." "Then you shall have the opportunity of enlarging your range," Holmes responded. "We will speak of it again. Come, Watson, your hat and coat. Lestrade, if you will precede us, we shall go directly to the hospital." A few minutes later, we had quitted the familiar warmth of our rooms and descended into the raw, fog-laden air of the street. The lamps were blurred halos in the murk, and the passers-by moved as dim shapes, their faces indistinct beneath the yellow gloom. Holmes paused for a moment on the threshold, his sharp gaze travelling along the flagstones before our door, up to the railings where the unknown man had leaned, and then to the upper windows of the houses opposite. "Mark this spot, Watson," he said quietly. 3 men have fallen within this small compass, if Lestrade's theory holds. Death has acquired a habit in Baker Street. Our task is to break it. With that, he stepped out into the fog at Lestrade's side, and I followed, my mind filled with a strange mingling of dread and anticipation as we turned our steps toward St. Bartholomew's and the silent witness who awaited us there. The gloomy corridors of St. Bartholomew's were well suited to the sombre errand which had brought us there. Our footsteps echoed upon the stone floors as Lestrade led the way, nodding curtly to a porter and passing through a pair of swinging doors that exhaled a breath of carbolic and cold air. "In here," he said, pausing before a side room off the main ward. "They've set him apart until the papers are made out." He pushed the door open, and we entered a small, whitewashed chamber lit by a single high window. Upon the central table, covered to the chin by a sheet, lay the form of the dead man. A young house surgeon with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers stood by the head of the table, making notes in a small book. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, glancing up. "Dr. Watson you already know by repute, if not by sight," said Holmes, indicating me with a slight inclination of the hand. "Inspector Lestrade you have met. You have examined the body?" "Briefly, yes," the surgeon replied. "There is nothing very remarkable to record. The man appears to have suffered a sudden failure of the heart or nervous system, but I can find no obvious lesion to account for it. If the police desire, a more thorough post-mortem can be arranged." Holmes stepped forward and drew back the sheet with a quick, deft movement. The face that was revealed to us was that of a man somewhat past middle age, with iron-grey hair thinning at the temples and a strong, square jaw. The features were composed, almost peaceful, but there was a curious tightness about the mouth and a faint, bluish shading at the lips which caught my professional eye. "You see, Mr. Holmes," the surgeon remarked, "not the countenance of one who has died in great pain. No contortions, no congested vessels about the eyes. It is as though he had been checked in the act of breathing, rather than strangled or suffocated in the ordinary sense." "Quite so," Holmes murmured. "Watson, your impression?" I bent over the dead man, taking in his waxen cheeks, the neat though somewhat worn collar, the faint scent of tobacco still clinging to the moustache. "There is some cyanosis," I said slowly, "but not in the degree one would expect an asphyxia. The pupils are slightly dilated. The man was well nourished, though no longer robust. The hands show some callus at the fingertips, as of one accustomed to writing, or perhaps to handling fine tools. I confess, Holmes, I see nothing here that would explain a sudden collapse of this nature." "Precisely," he answered, and I saw a flicker of satisfaction in his keen grey eyes, as though my very perplexity confirmed some private theory of his own. "You observe the hands, Watson. Let us look more closely at them." Taking up one of the lifeless hands between thumb and forefinger, he examined the nails, the skin, and the creases of the joints with minute care. Suddenly he produced his lens and bent still nearer, emitting a short, sharp exclamation. "Ha! What have we here?" Lestrade, who had been shifting impatiently from foot to foot, craned forward. "What is it now, Mr. Holmes?" he demanded. Holmes did not answer at once. He traced, with the tip of his finger, a faint reddish mark upon the inside of the wrist, scarcely more than a pinprick. "Dr. Watson," he said, "you will agree that this is no ordinary abrasion." I stooped over and saw, under the lens he held out to me, a tiny puncture surrounded by a faint, discoloured halo, like a minute bruise. "It might be the mark of a hypodermic needle," I ventured. "Though it is unusually placed, one would more commonly select the forearm." "Very true," Holmes assented. "And yet, if one wished to introduce some agent swiftly into the circulation, and to do so with a minimum of disturbance, well, the wrist is not without its advantages. You will have noted also, Watson, the absence of any swelling or infiltration such as might suggest a gross irritant. Whatever was introduced was of the most delicate and subtle character." The young surgeon frowned. "You think, then, that he was poisoned?" he asked. "I think that the body of a man who dies without visible cause and bears upon it a mark such as this cannot be dismissed without a more rigorous inquiry," Holmes replied. "You will conduct your post-mortem, doctor, and you will be good enough to pay particular attention to the state of the heart, the lungs, and the spinal cord. Should you discover anything unusual, anything at all, you will communicate with me at Baker Street before you make your final report." The surgeon nodded, half curious, half sceptical. "I shall do so, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I own the case intrigues me. There is something not entirely ordinary in it." Holmes let the sheet fall gently back over the still face. "There is nothing upon his clothing that might identify him?" he asked. "Nothing," Lestrade put in. "We've been through every pocket. If he had a name to his back when he fell, someone took care to lift it off him before we arrived." "Someone who knew enough," Holmes remarked, "to relieve him of his papers, and yet left his money. A singular thief, Lestrade. You will have made inquiries in the neighbourhood?" "Of course." "No one saw anything beyond what I've told you. The constable on duty will swear that the man was alone when he noticed him against the railings." "No sign of a struggle, no cry for help." "If someone did for him, they were clever enough to do it without attracting so much as a dog's bark." Holmes stood silent for a few moments, his head bent, his long fingers drumming softly upon the table's edge. Then he straightened abruptly. "We have seen enough here for the present," he said. "Our next step lies in Baker Street itself. The pavement, the railings, the houses opposite. These are the pages on which our unknown antagonist has written his opening move. Come, Lestrade, Watson, you will not object to retracing our steps." "By no means," I replied, for the faint thrill that always accompanied the real beginning of an investigation had taken firmer hold upon me. The dead man's inscrutable face, the tiny, treacherous puncture upon his wrist, and the sinister note awaiting us at Baker Street all seemed threads of some dark pattern which only Holmes might unravel. A short while later, we were once more emerging into the fog-smeared streets, turning our faces back toward that familiar thoroughfare which, on this day of all days, had taken on an aspect at once menacing and mysterious. Holmes maintained a brisk silence on the way back, his long stride forcing Lestrade and myself to quicken our pace to keep abreast. I knew better than to disturb him when his mind was working thus. The very angle of his head and the distant gleam in his eye told me that he was turning over our scanty data with that marvelous rapidity which so often left me breathless. When we reached Baker Street, he checked suddenly and drew us toward the very length of railing which Lestrade had indicated earlier. "Here, Watson," said he quietly. "You will remember that the unknown man was first observed leaning against these bars. Let us suppose, for the moment, that he did not choose the spot at random." He drew a small tape from his pocket and measured rapidly from the corner to the place where the railings curved inward toward the house. 34 feet 5 inches from the lamp-post, he murmured. An odd distance at which to fall if one were simply taken ill while walking. Now, Lestrade, you spoke of there being no signs of a struggle. You are prepared to repeat that after a closer inspection. "I saw none, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade answered doggedly. "But have your look by all means. You've sharper eyes than any of us." Holmes was already upon his knees, his lens drawn forth, his face within a few inches of the stone flags. The fog swirled about us in chill eddies, and 2 or 3 passers-by turned to stare at the strange spectacle of the famous detective crawling along the pavement like some monstrous insect. "Observe, Watson," he said at length, indicating a faint discoloration upon the stone almost beneath the railings. What would you make of that? I bent down. There, scarcely distinguishable from the general grime, was a blurred oval patch, a shade darker than the surrounding surface. "It might be a damp mark," I ventured, "or a stain of mud." "It is the impression of a boot sole," said Holmes, "made not more than 12 hours ago. You perceive the curve here? It is from the toe only. A man stood very close to the railings, his weight thrown forward, as one might lean toward someone on the other side. The tread is narrow. Our visitor wore a light, well-made boot, not the heavy sort favoured by the labouring class. You notice also no nail marks, a gentleman's foot, depend upon it." "Then it may be our dead man's," Lestrade objected. Holmes shook his head. "No. Our unfortunate friend leaned his back, not his toes, against the iron. Look higher." With the quick agility of a cat, he rose and ran his fingers along the bars themselves. After a moment he uttered a small ejaculation and produced, between thumb and forefinger, a tiny fragment of something which at first I took for a curled hair. Under the lens, however, I saw that it was a short fibre of some dark material, finely woven with a glint of silver in its thread. "You will recall the scrap of cloth left upon our doorstep, Watson," he said. "Note the similarity of weave. It is not identical, but it is of kin. We have at least a suggestion that the owner of that fragment has stood here, close enough to the man who died, to leave this trace behind." He turned his gaze, then not to the pavement, but across the street. The houses opposite loomed out of the fog in irregular masses, their windows dim yellow squares in the murk. "Now ask yourself," Holmes continued, "why this particular spot? If you were to choose a place at which to wait for a man, knowing his habits, you would hardly take your station without some advantage of observation or escape. Look, Watson, what do you see directly opposite?" I followed the line of his pointing finger. One of the houses, a little taller than its neighbours, bore upon a brass plate the words Dr. Augustus R. Luders, physician and surgeon. Above the ground floor, a single blind on the first story was drawn halfway, leaving a narrow slit through which, even as we watched, a faint glow could be discerned. "A foreign name," I remarked. "German, is it not?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "Or Dutch, in any case not English. You will have noted, Watson, that our anonymous scrap of cloth was unlikely to be of domestic manufacture. Lestrade, what do you know of Dr. Augustus R. Luders?" "Next to nothing," the inspector replied. "We've had no dealings with him. Came into the street about a year ago, that's all I can say. Seems respectable enough. Patients at all hours, from what the constable tells me. Patients at all hours, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. And 3 unexplained deaths within a stone's throw of his door. It is at the least an interesting coincidence. You don't suggest, began Lestrade. I suggest nothing yet, Holmes cut in, but when a man with foreign training establishes himself quietly in a London street where persons begin to die without apparent cause, and where mysterious communications are slipped under doors, I consider it my duty to pay my respects. Come, Watson, we will call upon Dr. Luders in the character of neighbours concerned for the peace of Baker Street. He stepped briskly from the curb, and we followed him across the road. As we approached, I could see more clearly the little brass plate, recently polished, and the neat lace curtains in the lower windows. Holmes pulled the bell. There was a pause, then the scrape of bolts, and the door was opened by a thin, pale girl in a servant's cap, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of 3 gentlemen upon the step. "Is Dr. Luders at home?" Holmes asked, with that courteous gravity he could assume at will. "Yes, sir," she stammered. "If you'll step in." We were shown into a modest but well-kept waiting room, where the odour of antiseptic mingled with that of stale tobacco and cheap cologne. Holmes's eyes made a swift circuit of the apartment, lingering for the barest instant upon a black cloak hanging on a peg, its edge trimmed with tarnished silver. Before I could speak, the inner door opened and a man entered, a lean figure in a dark frock coat with close-cropped fair hair, a pointed beard, and cold, light-coloured eyes that missed none of us as they passed rapidly from face to face. "I am Dr. Luders," he said, in precise but strongly accented English. "You wish to consult me, gentlemen?" Holmes inclined his head with that grave courtesy which so often disarmed the suspicious. "In a sense, yes, doctor," he replied. "We are your neighbours from across the street. My name is Sherlock Holmes, this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, and our acquaintance, Mr. Lestrade. An unfortunate event in the roadway this morning has given us cause to intrude upon you for a few moments, if you will permit it." Something flickered for an instant in Luders's pale eyes at the mention of the death, but his manner remained composed. "Ah, yes," he said slowly, "the man who fell. I have already heard something of it, from my maid and from a constable who called. Please, be seated. If I can be of any assistance, I am at your disposal." We took the 3 chairs that stood about a small table. The room, though modest, was orderly to the point of austerity. A glass-fronted cabinet of instruments gleamed on one wall. On another, framed certificates in German script hung neatly in a row. A faint odour of ether lingered in the air. Holmes's glance, under drooping lids, missed nothing. It rested a fraction of a second longer upon the black cloak with the tarnished silver edging that hung upon the peg behind the door, then drifted on to a side table where a metal tray bore several hypodermic syringes of unusual delicacy, their needles fine as hairs. "You are from the continent, I perceive," Holmes began in his most conversational tone. "The University of Heidelberg, if I am not mistaken, and some years in hospital work at Leipzig before you came to London." A shadow of surprise crossed Luders's face. "Your reputation is not exaggerated, Mr. Holmes," he said, with a thin smile. "Heidelberg and Leipzig, yes. I did my examinations there. As to how you know it, well, that is perhaps your business." "The style of your diploma," Holmes returned, lightly, waving a hand towards the wall, "combined with the particular cut of your cuffs and the chalk dust upon your sleeve, where you have recently been drawing upon a blackboard, these things speak loudly enough to a practised ear. But let us not digress. You have been questioned already, you say?" The constable inquired whether I had seen the man before he fell. Luders answered. "I had not. My first patient today did not come until after 8. Before that, I was at breakfast in my own room. I heard nothing in the street, no cry, no commotion, until the rattle of the stretcher wheels. Lestrade's jaw thrust forward a little. You've not attended such a man in your practice, he put in. Middle-aged, grizzled hair, square jaw, might have been in business, or a clerk. I have attended many such men, Luders replied calmly, but none whom I can connect with this case. If I had recognized him, I should have said so. Holmes crossed one long leg over the other and laced his fingers. You have been in Baker Street about a year, I think, he remarked. In that time there have been, as you know, several sudden deaths in this neighborhood. Does that circumstance strike you at all? The doctor shrugged his narrow shoulders. In a great city, people die every day, he said. Old men in the street, clerks at their desks, ladies in their drawing rooms. If you begin to look for patterns in such things, you may find them where none exist. I am a physician, Mr. Holmes, not a mystic. None the worse for that, Holmes murmured. Yet even a physician may be struck by peculiarities. For example, 3 deaths within a small radius, all without obvious cause. Luders's lips tightened for an instant. I have heard the talk, he said shortly. Some say the street is unlucky, others that there is a ghost. Such things are, how do you say, for the servants' gossip. I occupy myself with the living. When they come to me, I do what I can. When they do not, I cannot help them. His tone was reasonable enough, yet there was in it, or so it seemed to me, a certain hardness that jarred. Holmes appeared quite unruffled. You have not, I suppose, been disturbed by any unusual sounds of late? He asked carelessly. Footsteps on the stairs when there is no one there, for example, or knockings at curious hours? Our house, you know, is acquiring a reputation it scarcely deserves. A faint smile, gone almost before it appeared, touched Luders's mouth. I have heard the stories, he answered. Your landlady's maid is acquainted with my own, and tongues are quick. No, Mr. Holmes, I have heard nothing, save the ordinary noises of London. If you have ghosts, they do not cross the street. Comforting, at least, Holmes said. One last question, Doctor. You have made a special study, I see, of the nervous system. He had risen and stood now before the framed certificates, his back to our host. I saw his hand, apparently by chance, brush the edge of the hanging cloak, and in the next instant something dark and thread-like lay concealed in his palm. Yes, Luders replied. The nerves, the circulation, the finer questions of impulse and inhibition, that was my work at Leipzig. Why do you ask? Because, said Holmes quietly, turning to face him, we have just looked upon a man who appears to have died from some sudden interference with those very functions, and I am curious by nature. That is all. You have been most obliging, Dr. Luders. If any further detail should occur to you, a face you recall, a name, you will perhaps be good enough to let Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard know of it. The doctor inclined his head. Certainly, he said. I should be happy to aid the law if I can. A few minutes later, we had taken our leave and were once more in the chill street. Holmes walked on in silence until we had recrossed to our own side and mounted halfway to our door. Then he paused, his eyes alight. Well, Watson, he said, opening his hand to show me a second tiny fibre, dark with a thread of dull silver, lying beside the first upon his palm. Our neighbour across the way, it appears, is the best-dressed suspect Baker Street has yet afforded us. Holmes closed his fingers over the 2 dark threads, and we continued up the stairs. Lestrade, who had been frowning thoughtfully, burst out as we reached our own landing. You don't mean to say, Mr. Holmes, that you seriously connect that foreign doctor with this business because his cloak's a bit fancy and he's got a tray of syringes?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Lestrade, I should be loth to condemn any man upon so slight a foundation," he answered. "But when a set of circumstances arrange themselves in a line which points toward one individual, it is my practice, at least, to take note of where that line leads. Come in, both of you. We will put our facts upon the table and see how they look in the lamplight." We entered our sitting room, where the fire burned low and the familiar clutter of books, pipes, and chemical apparatus seemed, by contrast with the fog-dimmed street, almost homely. Holmes went straight to the mantelpiece, laid the 2 new fibres beside the strip of black cloth and the first thread he had taken from the railings, and regarded them through his lens. "You will observe, Watson," he said, "that all 3 share the same peculiar twist of the silver edging. It is not a common pattern. Our unknown correspondent, our midnight visitor to the railings, and Dr. Luder's cloak are at the very least of the same tailor's acquaintance. That does not prove that the doctor himself leant across those railings, but it narrows our field in an interesting way." Lestrade grunted. "Cloaks can be borrowed," he muttered. "Undoubtedly," said Holmes, "or stolen, or imitated. You perceive, Watson, that we are not yet at the point of drawing conclusions. We merely accumulate probabilities. Add to this the tiny puncture upon the dead man's wrist, and the fact that our neighbour is an expert in the very branch of physiology whose disturbance appears to have killed him. Again, not proof, but an alignment. And the note," I put in. "We must not forget the note, Holmes." He took it up between thumb and forefinger and read once more, in that dry tone with which he was wont to disarm the most sinister sentences, "He is not the first, and he will not be the last. The debt of Baker Street is not yet paid." "Mark, Watson," he continued, "the writer's curious choice of phrase, not your debt, or Holmes's debt, but the debt of Baker Street. Our street has, it seems, offended someone. Or someone wishes us to believe that it has. Which of the 2, I wonder?" Lestrade shifted uneasily in his chair. "Whatever it means, Mr. Holmes, I'll tell you this," he said. "If another man drops in this road without a mark on him, there'll be the devil to pay in the papers. They'll have you and the Yard in the same column." Holmes's eyes twinkled for an instant. "In that case, Lestrade, it becomes a matter of self-preservation for both of us," he said. "We must prevent that 3rd death." "Third?" I interjected. "You count Harrington, Phelps, and this unknown man. Surely that makes 3 already?" Holmes shook his head. "The writer of this note speaks prospectively," he said. "He is not the first, and he will not be the last. Harrington and Phelps belong to the past. Our shade threatens the future. There is at least one more victim marked down in his ledger." A chill passed through me at his words. Holmes, however, seemed only the more braced by the prospect. "It is now," he observed, glancing at the clock, 20 minutes past 3. In a little more than half an hour, if the pattern holds, our unseen visitor will be on the stairs. That will afford us an opportunity which I have no intention of neglecting. You will oblige me by making yourselves as comfortable as possible and by refraining from any remark, however profound, which might distract my attention from the sounds outside." He drew the armchair which commanded the door slightly back into the shadow and seated himself. His lean figure relaxed, his eyes half closed, yet with an alertness in every line of him that I had come to know. Lestrade took the corner of the sofa. I placed myself near the table, from which I could both see Holmes's face and watch the latch of the door. The minutes crept by with an exasperating deliberation. The ticking of the clock, the occasional crack of the fire, and the far-off rumble of wheels in the street below stood out with unnatural distinctness upon the silence. Once Lestrade shifted his weight and the springs of the sofa creaked, Holmes's hand went up in a swift gesture of warning. At 5 minutes to 4, he rose noiselessly, crossed to the door, and made some small adjustment to the key and handle which I could not see. Then he returned to his chair and resumed his former attitude. It wanted but 2 minutes to the hour when I felt, rather than heard, a subtle change in the air. There was a pause in the street sounds, as though the city itself were listening. Then, clear and distinct as before, came the tread upon the stairs, slow, measured, 1 step at a time. Lestrade started, his eyes widening. "You hear it?" I whispered. Holmes's finger was at his lips. The footsteps ascended, 1, 2, 3. Each fall of the unseen foot rang out upon the wooden treads outside. They reached our landing. There could be no mistake. The sound was immediately beyond the panel. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Now, Watson!" he cried softly. "Quickly!" He was on his feet. I sprang to the door and flung it wide at the very instant that the next step should have sounded. The landing lay empty, as before. Yet this time there was a difference. A faint, metallic vibration, like the dying hum of a plucked wire, trembled in the air. Holmes darted past me, his hand sliding along the underside of the banister. "Ha!" he exclaimed, stooping. "Our ghost, it seems, has bones of brass." He straightened, with some small object between his fingers, which he slipped very swiftly into his pocket before either Lestrade or I could distinguish its nature. Then, with a composure that contrasted oddly with the suddenness of his movement, he closed the door again and resumed his seat. "You will admit, at least," he said calmly, "that we are dealing with something more substantial than a disembodied spirit. That, Lestrade, is 1 step forward. There remain several others. And now, if you please, I must ask you both to leave me to my thoughts for an hour. I have a little piece of private reasoning to perform, and I can best accomplish it in solitude." There was that in his tone which brooked no argument. Lestrade rose reluctantly. "You'll let me know, Mr. Holmes, if you come to any conclusion that concerns the yard," he said. "When I come to a conclusion, Inspector, you may rely upon being the first to hear it," Holmes replied. "Meanwhile, keep a discreet eye upon Dr. Augustus R. Luders, and see that no stranger loiters too long upon our pavement. There is a man out there," he added softly, "more to himself than to us, who believes that Baker Street owes him a debt. I shall be curious to learn in what currency he intends to collect it." Left thus abruptly dismissed, Lestrade and I withdrew without further protest. The inspector muttered something about queer goings-on as we descended the stairs together. "You may rely on me for the watch on Luders, Mr. Holmes," he called back from the landing, but Holmes had already turned his chair slightly from the fire, as if, in withdrawing from the world, he had drawn an invisible curtain across the room. In the street, Lestrade took his leave, promising to return should any word come from the hospital. For my own part, I wandered aimlessly for a few minutes along the pavement, my mind too full of our strange experiences to turn at once to the prosaic demands of my practice. The fog had thickened, the lamps glowed like dim moons in a yellow sky. Ghosts of hansoms slid by, their drivers muffled to the eyes. The whole scene seemed in keeping with that unseen enemy who had chosen Baker Street for his theatre. At length I reascended the familiar steps and let myself quietly into our rooms. Holmes had not moved. He sat as we had left him, his head sunk forward, his long fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed. Only the faint, restless twitching of his hands betrayed the activity of the mind within. Knowing that he disliked even the shadow of observation at such times, I took up a medical journal and seated myself by the window. The print swam unheeded before my eyes. My thoughts ran instead upon the dead man's still face, the sinister scrap of foreign cloth, the cold eyes of Dr. Luders, and the mysterious contrivance which Holmes had plucked from the banister. What sort of brain, I asked myself, contrived to haunt a staircase with phantom footsteps while men died without a visible mark at our very door? The clock upon the mantel chimed the quarter, then the half-hour. At last, as the hand moved toward the next stroke, Holmes stirred. He rose abruptly, went to the table and drew the lamp nearer. The sudden blaze of light showed me that he had laid out, side by side, the note, the strip of cloth, the dark fibres, and, in the midst of them, a small brass object, no larger than my thumb, but of most intricate construction. "Come, Watson," he said. "You have been patient. You shall have your reward. Cast your eye upon our phantom." I rose and bent over the table. The thing he indicated was made of a narrow brass plate, slightly curved, with a tiny hinged arm at one end and a minute spring coiled about its axis. At the other extremity was fixed a thin tongue of metal, flattened and broadened like a miniature hammer. A length of fine wire was attached to the arm, its end coiled as though to pass around some hidden wheel. "You see the principle?" Holmes asked. "I confess I do not," I admitted. "It is simplicity itself," he replied. "This device was fixed beneath one of the treads of the stair. The tension of the spring was regulated by means of a weight and escapement which I have already removed to release the arm at certain intervals. When released, the little hammer struck smartly against the underside of the wood, producing that most deceptive of all sounds, a footstep upon a hollow stair. The vibration you heard a moment ago was the dying tremor of the spring when I detached it." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "Then all this talk of hauntings has served precisely the purpose for which it was designed," Holmes said coolly. "It has unsettled the servants, distorted the evidence of their senses, and prepared the ground for any number of wild tales. A rational mind, confronted with these deaths, is thus invited to waste its strength upon irrational explanations. Our opponent understands psychology, Watson, as well as mechanics." "Then you are convinced that the footsteps and the deaths are the work of one and the same hand?" I asked. He gave a slight shrug. "I am convinced that a man who will go to such pains to create an illusion is unlikely to be an idle practical joker," he answered. "He has labored to attach to this house a reputation which will hamper clear investigation. That labor coincides remarkably with a series of deaths for which no ordinary cause can be found. It is not proof, but it is enough to make me treat every incident as part of a single design." He took up the note again and tapped it thoughtfully. "The debt of Baker Street," he repeated. "There lies our missing piece. A debt implies an obligation. Who in all this great, indifferent city believes that Baker Street, this street, these houses, perhaps this very room, owes him reparation? When we have answered that, we shall know whose hand wound this spring, and whose drug stilled the heart of the unknown man at our railings." A sharp rap upon the downstairs door, followed by the murmur of voices, cut across his words. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale with excitement. "A message for you, sir," she cried, holding out an envelope. "From the hospital. The boy said it were urgent." Holmes took it with a quick nod and tore it open. His eyes ran down the page. I saw them brighten with that fierce light I knew so well. "Excellent!" he exclaimed. "Our friends at Bart's justify my confidence. Listen, Watson. Post-mortem reveals no structural lesion of heart or lungs. Spinal cord shows slight congestion. Microscopic examination of blood suggests action of a powerful but delicate neurotoxin, just as we suspected, introduced, in our opinion, by hypodermic injection shortly before death. Minute trace of unknown alkaloid isolated. We await further instruction." A neurotoxin, I repeated. Then the puncture was the doorway by which death entered, Holmes finished. Mark, too, the elegance of the method. No gross violence, no obvious poison. Merely a body that ceases to function as though a switch had been turned. And who in Baker Street is best equipped with syringes of unusual delicacy and an expert knowledge of the nervous system? Luders, I murmured involuntarily. Holmes's eyes met mine. Name no man guilty in advance of proof, he said sharply. But we must certainly consider what use an unscrupulous physician might make of his skill if some private enmity or some imagined debt were driving him. Before we sleep tonight, Watson, I must know more of Dr. Augustus R. Luders, whence he came, whom he has treated, and whether any of his former patients lie as inexplicably still as our friend at Bart's. He folded the telegram and slipped it into his pocket. The board is set, he said softly. Our enemy has made 3 moves. It is time that Baker Street replied in kind. Put on your thickest coat, my dear fellow. We have a call to make in the fog, one that our neighbour across the way would hardly anticipate. I had long since learned that when Holmes spoke in that particular quiet tone, with the faintest edge of excitement beneath it, resistance was useless. I fetched my overcoat and muffler without a word. In a few moments more we were once again in the street, the fog pressing close about us like a living thing. You will observe, Watson, Holmes remarked as we turned away, not toward the Strand or the Yard, but in the opposite direction, that our neighbour's attention will be fixed, so far as it is fixed at all, upon Baker Street itself, upon the Yard, upon the hospital, upon us. He will not, I think, anticipate our taking an interest in the ancestry of a piece of brass. The ancestry, I repeated. Precisely. You see only a small contrivance. I see a signature. The curve of that plate, the thread of that screw, the tempering of that spring, these things proclaim their maker as clearly as your handwriting proclaims you. We are going, he added, hailing a passing hansom, to pay our respects to a certain Mr. Joshua Merryweather of Littlebrook Street off Holborn. You may recall his name from that small matter of the curious alarm clock in the affair of the vanishing clerk. The cab jolted forward through the yellow murk. I sat back, my curiosity pricked. You believe this step apparatus to be his work? I asked. I should be greatly surprised if it were not, Holmes replied. There are perhaps 6 mechanicians in London who could produce such a toy. There is only one who would waste so elegant an escapement upon so trivial a purpose. Merryweather is an artist. He cannot help himself. We drew up at last before a narrow shop squeezed between a baker's and a dingy public house. In the window, beneath fly-blown cards, there glittered a strange assortment of watches, barometers, music boxes, and ingenious little instruments whose uses I could not guess. A small bell tinkled sharply as Holmes pushed open the door. Within, at a bench littered with gears and coils, sat a very bald little man in enormous spectacles. He looked up with a start, then his round face broke into a smile of recognition. Mr. Holmes? And the doctor? Yes? Always it is something uncommon when you come. What is it today? A clock that walks? A box that sings? Holmes returned his greeting cordially enough, but I could see his eyes already roving over the walls, taking in the tools, the fragments, the finished work, with a swift, appraising glance. On the contrary, my dear Merryweather, he said, it is something which walks without a clock, at least to all appearances. I should value your opinion of this. He produced the brass mechanism and laid it upon the bench. Merryweather bent over it, his breath puffing whitely upon the metal in the chill air. "Ah!" he exclaimed, adjusting his spectacles with nervous fingers. "But this, I know this very piece. I made it." "For what purpose?" Holmes asked. though I was certain he had already guessed. "For an experiment," the gentleman said, Merryweather answered, his little hands hovering over the spring with unconscious proprietorship. "A device to reproduce the sound of footsteps at intervals. It amused me, the idea. I like such playthings. See, here is the groove where the weight ran, and here the catch that holds. Yes, yes, I remember exactly." "And the gentleman?" said Holmes lightly. "You have many customers, no doubt, but this one—" Merryweather pursed his lips, frowning in concentration. "A foreign gentleman," he said at last. "Very precise, very particular. He brought me a drawing, most exact, with measurements in millimeters, not inches. Tall, thin, with a small beard, so not English, German perhaps, or Dutch." I saw Holmes's eyelids flicker. "Did he give a name?" he asked carelessly. Merryweather shook his head. "He paid in cash," he said. "He called it a scientific demonstration. He wanted 3 of the mechanisms all the same. I told him it was much trouble, but he insisted. A week later he came back for another. 4 in all. It was 3 months ago, or a little more. He said nothing of where he would use them." "And he has not returned since?" "No, but this—" He tapped the brass device with a forefinger. "This is one of mine, I swear it. Who has broken my good work, eh?" Holmes smiled and slipped the contrivance back into his pocket. "A very fine piece it is," he said. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Merryweather. If ever I require a ghost to walk again, I shall know where to come." We left the little man blinking after us and stepped once more into the fog. For some minutes Holmes was silent, his chin sunk upon his breast, his hands thrust deep into his overcoat pockets. At last he spoke. "You perceive, Watson," he said, "that Dr. Luders is not our only foreigner with an interest in Baker Street. There is at least one other, tall, thin, bearded, who prefers cash to introductions and metric measurements to imperial. Our neighbour may be either the brain or the tool, we have not yet determined which." "You think, then, that Luders himself may not have ordered these mechanisms?" I ventured. "I think it imprudent to fasten our suspicion too eagerly upon the most obvious candidate," he replied. "It is the favourite error of the police. Luders has knowledge, opportunity, and, in all likelihood, patients who might be used as experimental material, but he also has a visible position and a reputation to lose. A second man, in the shadows, might well find his account in using such a practitioner for his purposes." "And the debt?" I asked. "We are no nearer to knowing why someone should feel wronged by a street." "On the contrary," Holmes said slowly, "we are a trifle nearer. A street is a collection of houses. A house is a collection of names upon its doors. Somewhere in the history of those names lies the origin of that debt. Before the night is out, I propose to consult a certain set of records at the Marylebone Vestry, for there, if anywhere, we may find who has passed through Baker Street and who might have left an enemy behind him." He checked himself and glanced at me. "But first," he added, "there is a move to be made upon the board. Our adversary is cautious. We must give him the illusion of certainty. When we return to Baker Street, I shall indite a small note for publication in the evening papers. It will announce, on excellent authority, that the death of this morning was due to natural causes, and that no further inquiry is contemplated. That should tempt our friend to advance his next piece." "You would risk another life?" I cried. Holmes's thin lips tightened. "I would risk nothing that could be spared," he said gravely. "But he has marked down his victim already. My object is to stand, if I may, between the stroke and its object. To do that, I must persuade him that the way is clear and the street still in his power. Come, Watson. The fog thickens and Baker Street waits. We have work yet before we sleep, and there is a man abroad who counts upon the indifference of London. We must see to it that for once London disappoints him. Holmes's prediction that our adversary would be watching Baker Street was, I am convinced, no mere figure of speech. As we turned into the familiar thoroughfare once more, I saw his eyes sweep in one swift, all-embracing glance over the dim doorways, the upper windows, and the shadowed entries. To my more prosaic sight there was nothing to distinguish this evening from 100 others. A milk cart rattling in the distance, a ragged newsboy bawling the late edition, a maid hurrying with a covered basket. Yet I knew that Holmes, in that instant, had taken the pulse of the street. Within our rooms he lost no time. Seating himself at the table, he drew a sheet of notepaper towards him and wrote rapidly. "This," he remarked, as his pen scratched across the page, "is in the style of a certain medical correspondent who delights to cloak his ignorance in technical terms. Observe. In the regrettable case of sudden collapse reported from Baker Street this morning, I am authorized to state that a careful examination has revealed purely natural causes. No trace of violence or toxic agency has been detected, and public alarm is therefore unwarranted. That should soothe our friend's nerves." "You think he reads the evening papers?" I asked. "He is a Londoner. He murders in a London street. He is exquisitely interested in how London takes it," Holmes replied. "Yes, he reads them, and when he reads this, he will congratulate himself that his little hypodermic toy has done its work, leaving no trail. That self-congratulation, Watson, may tempt him to haste. It is when a man feels secure that he steps most boldly and most carelessly." He folded the note, addressed it in a different hand to the editor of a well-known evening journal, and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "This is to go at once to the nearest pillar box," he said. "You will oblige me by sending a boy. It is of some importance." When the door had closed again, he glanced at the clock. "We have, I think, an hour before the vestry offices close," he observed. "Time enough if we do not dawdle. Bring your revolver, Watson." "My revolver," I exclaimed. He slipped his own into the pocket of his overcoat with that matter-of-fact air which always impressed me more than any emphasis. "You will forgive the precaution," he said. "We are dealing with a person who carries death upon the point of a needle. I prefer that the next sudden collapse in Baker Street should not be mine or yours." The Marylebone vestry offices presented at that hour a melancholy aspect. A single clerk, his sleeves rolled up and his pen behind his ear, looked up with ill-disguised surprise as we entered the long, dusty room lined with shelves of ledgers. "Parochial rate books for Baker Street," Holmes demanded, producing a visiting card with a penciled note upon it. "You have authority, you see. We will not detain you long." The card, I gathered, bore some scrawl from a magistrate of Holmes's acquaintance, for the clerk's manner underwent a transformation. He led us to a side table and, after some searching, brought down several enormous volumes which thudded upon the wood like coffins. Holmes set to work at once with the eagerness of a hound on a fresh scent. His long, nervous fingers turned the pages with astonishing rapidity, his eye darting from column to column. "You perceive my purpose, Watson?" he said, without looking up. "Our note speaks of the debt of Baker Street. Debts are usually contracted between individuals. I seek, first, any name which recurs at both our own number and that of Dr. Luder's, or at any house lying between. Failing that, I seek any entry which has been heavily annotated. Men write in margins when something has gone amiss. For my own part, I could make little of the crabbed lists of names and figures. To Holmes, however, they were as legible as a railway timetable. Presently he emitted a short sound of satisfaction. "Here, Watson," he murmured. "Observe. Number 223, now Luders' house, formerly let to one Professor Hermann Schneider, occupation, lecturer. Dates of tenancy, 3 years, note in margin, removed on order of police. And now, see here, the same name appears earlier at another address at our own. I bent over the page. Sure enough, against 221B Baker Street, there stood the entry, some 4 years old. Schneider, Hermann, German subject. To the side, scrawled in a different hand, were the words, evicted after complaint. To see file. Schneider, Holmes repeated softly. We have met the type before, Watson, foreign lecturer, dabbling in borderline sciences, a little hypnotism, a little electrical display, a little fraudulent mediumship to amuse idle Londoners. I have an indistinct recollection of hearing the name in some connection. We must follow this up. He closed the ledger with a decisive snap. You will kindly indicate, he said to the clerk, where the files of complaints are kept for these years. The case of Professor Schneider interests me exceedingly. Another 10-minute search produced a thin bundle of papers tied with tape. Holmes untied it and ran his eye over the headings. I saw the name Schneider recur on several sheets. On one, in particular, his gaze lingered. Ha! He exclaimed. Listen to this, Watson. Complaint lodged by tenants and neighbours respecting dangerous experiments and suspected fraud at 221B Baker Street. Subject, Professor Hermann Schneider. Allegations, inducing trances, administering unknown substances, attempting so-called test of fearlessness upon unwilling participants. Police intervention at request of landlord, premises entered, apparatus confiscated, subject cautioned, and subsequently deported as undesirable alien. Good heavens, I cried. And all this took place under this very roof. Before our time, Holmes replied, but not before someone conceived a grudge. Note, Watson, the phrases apparatus confiscated and deported as undesirable. Such words burn themselves into certain natures. Imagine the feelings of a vain, unscrupulous experimenter whose work is publicly branded as dangerous charlatanry. He would not forget the house that witnessed his humiliation. To his mind, Baker Street, not the police, not the magistrate, but the street itself, has contracted a debt. You think, then, that Schneider has returned? I said. I think, Holmes answered slowly, that somewhere in London there moves a tall, thin foreigner, bearded, precise, who orders step mechanisms in metric measure and understands death by nervous shock. Whether he calls himself Schneider or some other name, the soul within is of the same pattern, and I think it not improbable that he has found in Dr. Luders either a pupil, a tool, or an unwitting shield behind which to resume his experiments. As he spoke, the distant clang of a church bell marked the hour. Holmes tied up the papers and restored them to the clerk with a brief word of thanks. We have what we need, Watson, he said, as we stepped once more into the fog-laden street. The past has spoken. It remains for the present to answer. Our enemy believes Baker Street betrayed him once. He will strike there again. Let us see if we cannot arrange that when he does. It is not a helpless stranger who meets him, but someone a trifle better prepared. We were within 100 yards of our own door, when a figure loomed suddenly out of the mist. A constable, his helmet beaded with damp, his face anxious. "Mr. Holmes, sir?" he called, peering at us. "You're wanted at once in Baker Street. There's been—" He broke off, swallowing. "There's been another collapse, sir, and this time it's one of your own neighbours." Holmes's hand closed for an instant upon my arm. I could feel the sudden tautening of the muscles beneath his sleeve. "Where?" he asked. "Across the way, sir. Dr. Luders' house," the constable panted. "One of the lodgers from number 2 up. Dropped like a stone on the doorstep before the doctor's very eyes. They've sent for the ambulance, but—" Well, it looks bad, sir. Holmes's face hardened. Come, Watson, he said briefly. There is yet a chance your art may snatch one man back from our friend's ledger. We broke into a run. Even through the fog, I could see a knot of figures on the pavement before Ludas's door, a maid weeping into her apron, a cabman craning over the shoulders of a policeman, 2 or 3 loafers drawn by the scent of tragedy. As we pushed through, they fell back at the sight of Holmes's hawk-like profile and my own medical bag, which I had fortunately brought. The man on the step was of the respectable clerkly type we had already met in this grim affair, sallow, thin-shouldered, perhaps 45 years of age. His head lolled, his eyes were half open and glassy, his breath came in shallow jerks that were more reflex than respiration. Kneeling, I felt for the pulse at his wrist. It fluttered beneath my fingers like a trapped bird. Still alive, I muttered. Only just. Holmes's hand came down upon mine, turning the wrist sharply so that the inner side was exposed. There, fresh and unmistakable, was the tiny puncture we had seen upon the other body, with the faintest reddened halo already forming about it. As I feared, Holmes said quietly, "You see, Watson, the mark is scarcely 5 minutes old. Our man is working close upon our heels." I glanced up. Above us, in the open doorway, Dr. Ludas stood, his pale face impassive, his light eyes coolly observant. "I have already sent for assistance," he remarked. The man collapsed as he was leaving my door. I had scarcely touched him when the constable arrived, and insisted that no one should disturb the body. I told him it was useless, but— "You examined him," Holmes interposed. "Naturally, I am a physician." There was little to be done. Holmes's gaze rested upon him in a long, unreadable stare. "On the contrary," he said softly, "there is a great deal to be done. For him, for Baker Street, and for you. Watson, can you sustain him for 10 minutes? "I will do what I can," I replied curtly. For something in Ludas's composure stirred a deep indignation within me. I loosened the man's collar, applied such restoratives as I had, and began that mechanical manipulation of the chest by which we hoped to assist his flagging heart. Holmes bent close to my ear. "The poison acts upon the nervous centres," he whispered. "If you can keep the breathing and circulation going until we have found its source, he may yet live. I leave him in your hands." He straightened, his whole manner altering in a flash from the intimate to the official. "Inspector Lestrade is not here?" he demanded of the constable. "On his way, sir. I sent a boy." "Then we must not keep him waiting for his man," said Holmes. "Dr. Ludas, I must ask the favour of a few words with you in private." The doctor's brows rose a fraction. "In the midst of this—" he began. "In the midst of this," Holmes repeated with a sudden steel in his tone that brought the other's protest to an abrupt halt. "You have a surgery within. We will not detain you long." For an instant, Ludas seemed about to refuse. Then, with a slight, almost theatrical inclination of the head, he stepped back, holding the door wider. "As you please, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Enter." They passed inside together, leaving me upon the step with my unconscious patient and the little ring of onlookers. The minutes dragged, heavy with effort and suspense. The man beneath my hands was no more to me than a bundle of failing muscles and stuttering nerves, yet the thought that he lay there as a pawn in some cold-blooded experiment lent a personal urgency to my labours. Presently there came from within the house the sharp sound of raised voices, the deeper, resonant accents of Holmes, the higher, tenser tones of Ludas replying in quick, staccato bursts. Then a scuffle, a chair overturned, the metallic clatter of something striking the floor. I started up, but the constable laid a hand upon my shoulder. "Best keep at him, sir," he muttered. "If Mr. Holmes wants us, he'll call." He had barely finished speaking when the door was flung open and Holmes reappeared, his cravat awry, one sleeve darkened by a fresh smear. "You may come in, constable," he said curtly. "Dr. Luders has met with an accident while resisting arrest. You will find him in the surgery. The instrument with which he proposed to persuade me that Baker Street's account was overdue is upon the floor beside him. Handle it with care. It kills more quickly than a cosh." He glanced down at my patient, and his face softened. "Excellent, Watson," he murmured. "You have held the line. We must have him removed at once to Bart's. I think, with prompt treatment, he may yet live to give valuable testimony." Lestrade arrived upon the scene as we were placing the man upon the stretcher. "What's this, Mr. Holmes?" he cried. "You leave me for an hour and bring down half a riot in Baker Street." "Not a riot, Lestrade," said Holmes, with that dry humour which so often broke through at moments of tension. "Merely the end of a haunting and the arrest of a murderer. You will find Dr. Augustus R. Luders, otherwise Professor Hermann Schneider, somewhat the worse for having attempted to introduce his favourite neurotoxin into my circulation. Fortunately for me, my arm is longer than his." Lestrade stared. "Schneider," he repeated. "You mean the fellow as was deported?" "The same," Holmes answered. "Or at least the same intellect, hidden in a new name and a medical diploma of doubtful provenance. Your records at the vestry have been most instructive. Pray attend him, Inspector. He is alive. Indeed, I took care that he should be. A dead man tells no tales, and I desire very much to hear this one." It was not until some hours later, when the last statement had been taken, the prisoner removed under guard to a secure ward at the hospital, and my unfortunate patient pronounced by the house surgeon to be out of immediate danger, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more alone at Baker Street. The fog had thinned. A pale gleam of moonlight filtered through the curtains. Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile about his lips. His bandaged wrist rested upon a cushion. "You are sure there is no danger?" I asked anxiously, for the thought of that venomous needle turned even my practised stomach. "None, my dear Watson," he replied. "Our friend was premature. He struck before he had fully charged his weapon. A slight tingling, a momentary weakness, that was all. It was enough, however, to assure me that my surmise as to his method was not at fault." "You had guessed, then, that Luders and Schneider were one?" I said. He opened his eyes and regarded me with something of his old mischief. "Not guessed, Watson, perceived," he corrected. "The German diplomas, the interest in the nervous system, the foreign cloth upon the cloak, the coincidence of tenancy revealed in the vestry books all pointed in the same direction. When Merriweather described our unknown mechanic in Little Brook Street, the likeness was complete. A false beard and a new name do not change the angle at which a man carries his head." "And the debt?" I persisted. What did he mean by it? Holmes's expression grew graver. "To the mind of such a man," he said slowly, "the world is divided into two classes, himself and the fools who fail to appreciate him. Schneider's experiments at 221B were stopped, his apparatus confiscated, he was branded an impostor and expelled. In his warped imagination it was not the law nor his own misconduct, but Baker Street that had wronged him. The houses, the people, the very stones became his creditors in reverse. He would reclaim his due in the only coin he valued, fear. By killing men at our very door, I murmured. "By killing them in such a fashion," Holmes amended, "that no cause could be seen, leaving the superstition of the street to fill in the blanks. A man falls, there is no wound, no poison. Meanwhile, footsteps sound upon empty stairs and anonymous threats speak of a haunting. Before long, even the hard-headed begin to mutter of curses. Under that cover, he might have continued his private experiments indefinitely. It was, in its way, an ingenious scheme. He lit his pipe and lay back, the smoke wreathing his thin features. His miscalculation lay in his choice of theatre, he continued. Had he selected some other quarter of London, his ghost might have walked for years. But in choosing Baker Street, he forgot that one lodger in this particular house is even less fond of the supernatural than the police. The note, the cloth, the mechanism, the records, all these were his own work, and each, in turn, betrayed him. It is a principle I have often observed, Watson. The more elaborate the deception, the greater the number of tracks it leaves behind. And the victims? I asked softly. Harrington, Phelps, the unknown man, and nearly this poor clerk tonight? Holmes's eyes darkened. To the end, he regarded them as material, he said. Luders, Schneider, spoke quite candidly once he realized the game was up. He wished to demonstrate a new agent, subtle, instant, undetectable. What better proving ground than the very street which had once spat him out? He would make Baker Street itself his laboratory and his revenge. There is, I think, a cell in Broadmoor that will be better suited to his future experiments under supervision. We sat for a while in silence, each busy with his own thoughts. At last I glanced up to see Holmes regarding me with a faintly quizzical air. "You look disturbed, Watson," he said. "I confess," I answered, "that the thought of such malevolent intellect at our very door, and of our own unconscious share in an old injustice, is not a comfortable one." Holmes shrugged those expressive shoulders of his. "We are all, in some measure, answerable for the follies of our fellow men," he said. "But do not, I beg you, reproach yourself because a German charlatan chose to couch his spite in metaphors of debt. We have, I think, discharged any obligation we might have had to Baker Street by seeing that its phantom is laid." He gestured toward the stairs where, in the quiet of the late hour, only the normal creak and settle of the old house could be heard. "You will observe," he added lightly, "that our ghost has grown singularly bashful since we removed his brass bones. I fancy Mrs. Hudson will find the atmosphere more congenial." I laughed in spite of myself. "And you, Holmes?" I said. "You have drawn the poison, unmasked the murderer, and vindicated reason over superstition. Does it give you no satisfaction?" He smiled, that rare, sudden smile which transformed his ascetic features. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when a man has succeeded in doing that, he is well advised to thank Providence that he has not added his own name to the list of victims. As for satisfaction," he waved his pipe lazily toward the heap of commonplace books upon the table, "it lies there in the knowledge that once again a complex problem has yielded to simple principles. The rest is mere newspaper commentary." He closed his eyes, the smile still lingering. "Besides," he murmured, as the fire guttered and the fog pressed harmlessly against our windows, "Baker Street is quiet once more. Until the next debt presents itself, I see no reason why we should not enjoy a brief interval of peace." And so, with the phantom footsteps silenced and the haunting of Baker Street revealed as the work of a madman's logic rather than any visitation from beyond, we return to the tranquil routine of our life at 221B, that little island of reason in a city where, too often, fear walks louder than any tread upon the stairs